3 years ago, I released one of my first ever Warframe build guides on this channel, and you can tell because it looks absolutely terrible. However, point being, it was about Voruna, and Voruna now got her Prime, and she can walk on all four, so, I'd say it's about time for a couple updated builds, huh? As always, big shoutouts to all our generous channel members, and now, let's go. However, given the fact that it has been a hot minute since we last talked about her, let's first get into her skills and go over all the nice things that Voruna can do, starting out as per usual with the passive. And when it comes to that, Voruna actually has 4, one tied to each and every one of her 4 abilities. You can switch between these 4 passives by holding down the corresponding ability button, and in the bottom right corner of the screen, you can also see which selection you're currently on. The passive for your first ability is that you gain 50% more parkour velocity, which is additive to other sources of parkour velocity and will make you very speedy. Passive number 2 is very great because it gives you complete resistance to negative status effects. Just important to mention here, it's not a status cleanse, so negative effects that are already on you will remain on you, it just prohibits new negative status effects coming in. In my opinion, this is by far the best of her 4 passives, and in most cases I think you're probably gonna have this on constantly. Passive number 3 then would be having 90% heavy attack efficiency, so you only lose 10% of your combo counter whenever you perform a heavy attack. It kinda sorta says 100% heavy attack efficiency, but given that this variable is capped at 90% in the game, that means 90% is the best you'll ever get. When Voruna first came out, I thought this was one of the most broken things ever, but then again, in the time since, we've gotten Tennokai, which makes heavy attacks much more attractive, as well as the very recent new Tennokai mod, about which I made an entire video because it literally gives you infinite maximum 12x heavy attacks forever. So I think this passive kinda sorta fell off quite a bit. And then finally, passive number 4, that's essentially a get out of jail free card. Whenever you take lethal damage, just not gonna take lethal damage and instead become invulnerable for 3 seconds. However, it does have a 1-minute cooldown. I think all in all, this would be great as a passive if it was constantly on in the background, but given the fact that you would have to have it actively selected before dying, I kinda don't think it's really worth it. In my opinion, just focus on your 2, and that should do the trick for 90% of the gameplay. However, one last thing that is important to note about the passive is, if you replace any of your 4 abilities with a Helminth skill, then you will also lose access to the corresponding passive for that skill that you overwrote. Skill number 1 is called Shroud of Dynar, and this one is actually a handful. First of all, when you tap the ability button, you become invisible for a brief period of time. This invisibility will last either until the timer runs out, or until you attack an enemy with a melee or a ranged weapon. Once you do attack, the invisibility will be gone, however, this will then trigger a very strong buff for your melee weapons. To be more precise, your melee weapon will get a +2 times flat crit damage multiplier, plus 100% flat crit chance on top, and also plus 100% flat status chance, plus a guaranteed slash-status effect on every physical hit. Yeah! This is very, very strong, and it is also very nice because these values are flat, so they are able to elevate weapons with bad stats quite a bit. This melee buff will only last for 3 seconds at base, however, you can extend it once by 8 seconds at base by taking out an enemy. It should be said though, this only goes once per ability cast, so you can't keep this up constantly, which means overall, this is one of the abilities that you're gonna activate and deactivate quite a lot in your gameplay. Now, Shroud of Dynar also has an augment called Prey of Dynar, however, this one heavily ties into your second ability, so I don't want to talk about it just yet, and rather go over it once we've talked about number 2. So yeah, ability number 2, Fang of Raksh. This one, oh boy, this one is probably the strongest ability in Voruna's entire kit. When you press the ability button, you will jump at the enemy that you're currently aiming at and inflict 5 different random status effects, all at a maximum of 10 stacks. And if you like, you can activate it multiple times on the same enemy and get basically every status effect in the game at its maximum of 10 stacks. As you can undoubtedly see, this is very strong. Either as a status primer, so your weapons, if they have any sort of condition overload mods on them, deal significantly more damage, but to be honest, these status effects tend to be so strong that the ability itself is already capable of nuking entire rooms just with that. It should be said though that the status effects that are inflicted are really just the quote-unquote normal status effects, so stuff like Void, Tau, Knockdown, Stagger, Ragdoll, and so on and so forth, that she can unfortunately not use. And if you now think, oh boy, Arcane Impetus would be so strong on her, then you're absolutely correct. But we're gonna get to that when we talk about the builds later. However, all this status is not everything that the ability does, because if you manage to take out the affected enemy while the status is still on them, then they will spread all these status effects in an AoE to nearby enemies around them. However, one thing that should be said, if you attack the same enemy multiple times with this, and therefore inflict a lot of different status types, then when the enemy dies, only the initial 5 status effects with the first cast that you applied, only those will be spread to the enemies around, not everything that is on the enemy at that point. But now, let's talk about how this second ability works together with your first. First of all, given the fact that this second ability is not considered a weapon attack, that means you can use it while being invisible from your one without losing that invisibility. It should be said though that for a split second during the cast, you will drop out of the invisibility, but it will not cancel the first ability the same way that a weapon attack would. However, what's much more interesting would be talking about the augment for our first ability that we previously mentioned, called Prey of Dynar. This one makes it that, whenever you go into your invisibility with the one, it will visually highlight one enemy nearby. This marked enemy then will gain additional damage vulnerability, scaling with ability strength. However, if you use your second ability on that highlighted enemy, then the status spread radius when taking that enemy out will be increased by 150%. Those 150% don't scale with strength and don't scale with range, they're fixed. However, they're multiplicative to whatever your current radius is. That is a big range buff for the status spread of your second ability and makes this augment incredibly strong. Ability number 3, Lycath's Hunt. This one is fortunately a bit easier and straightforward to understand. When you turn on this ability, what will happen is, whenever you take out an enemy with a melee weapon or melee attack, that enemy has a 100% chance to drop a health orb. And when you take out an enemy with a headshot, then you have a 100% chance to drop an energy orb. The duration of this ability is also very generous, because whenever you eliminate an enemy with at least 5 different status effects on them, the duration is automatically gonna extend. So given the fact that your second ability neatly applies 5 different status effects, that means it is very easy to keep Lycath's Hunt on forever. Especially all the health drops that you're gonna get out of your melee kills. That means Lycath's Hunt is an absolute dream synergy with Equilibrium and will make sure that you never ever run out of energy. But if you wanted to incorporate headshots, you can of course also get a lot of energy orbs, fueling something like, let's say, energy conversion or health conversion for a lot of armor. Okay, ability number 4 is... It is really a handful. Like, the wiki article is ginormous, so please forgive me if I get something wrong here. Skill number 4 is called Ulfrun's Descent, and it is Voruna's ultimate. When you cast it, you will go into wolf mode, where you run on all 4. And yes, with the Prime version, you can actually run around on all 4 legs. Unlike the normal version where you only go down on all 4 if you're actually standing still, but not when you're running, and everybody hated that. So yeah, long story short, you can now actually be Wolf Girl. Hooray! But yeah, the main thing about this skill though is what you see under your crosshairs. When this skill is active, you gain access to 5 charge attacks. These charge attacks will last until you have consumed all of them, so there is no duration. And basically what that means is, as long as you have charges, you can either press your fire or your melee button to jump at an enemy and pounce on them to deal slash damage. Now, when it comes to the values of those attacks and the whole damage formula on how to calculate how much damage you deal with this is actually incredibly complicated, and I honestly don't think it is all too helpful to get into the nitty-gritty details here, so if you really want to know all the numbers, then check out the wiki. To break it down very simple though, Whenever you manage to directly take out an enemy with your charges, not with a damage over time status effect, it needs to be a direct kill, then you will see that there is a little multiplier added under your crosshair. This multiplier goes up to a maximum of 10 times, at which point you will have reached the maximum possible damage per hit. Also, whenever you do get one of these direct kills with the attack, it will refund one of your 5 charges, so that this way you can theoretically keep this skill up constantly. On top of that, however, you're not only dealing damage to the enemy that you're attacking directly, also there's a radius around that enemy in which you will stagger enemies and inflict additional slash damage to them. And finally, another little synergy here is, enemies with more different status effects on them will take additional damage from this. So it is highly incentivized to have a big status spread from your second ability before starting to pounce on the enemy. Now, when it comes to Ulfrun's Descent, I think this ability is kind of a bit finicky and could make great use of a bit of quality of life. See, my main issue with this is that you only start dealing significant damage once you get this multiplier up to the maximum of 10. However, in order to be able to do that, you need to score direct kills, not with damage over time, no nothing, and that can be quite difficult depending on the situation, with all the status and damage over time going on around you. On top of that, you also need to get direct kills in order to refund your charges, which is easier said than done in practical gameplay, and neatly leads us over to the augment called Ulfrun's Endurance. This one, and I really hate to say it, is the very definition of what a mandatory augment sounds like, because what this one does is, you now not only regenerate your charges when you directly kill an enemy with a pounce, but also whenever an enemy dies from slash damage over time in a radius around you. I think this should be part of the ability by default, or at least make it that this augment also charges up your multiplier with slash DOT kills. The way it is right now though, if you want to play Voruna into your 4th ability, it just kind of is a must-have, otherwise you're really not gonna have fun with it. But as always, I would have a lot of fun if you could give the video a quick like, because it helps me with the YouTube algorithm to get these guys out to more people. So thank you so much for your support. But now that you know what you can do, let's start diving into the meat and potatoes of today's video, and that would be the build section. As per usual, let's start discussing a couple of Helminth options. See, the thing with Voruna is that she doesn't really have any necessary Helminth abilities that you have to have. One thing I should mention though is, if you want to build her primarily into her second ability to status spread and nuke this way, then I would highly recommend going for Roar, as it massively increases the DOT from all the status effects that you're gonna inflict, because you know, Roar's faction damage, double dips, yada yada yada. Long story short, for the nuke build, you kinda sorta wanna have it. However, if you feel that she's a bit too glass cannon-y, then you might wanna go for something like Mirage's Eclipse that will give you another layer of damage reduction. Another very obvious synergy, of course, would be Wrathful Advance from Kullervo, because Voruna's kit is heavily tailored towards a melee playstyle, so of course, using the one ability that makes melees ridiculously OP, that is a very nice synergy. As for the Archon Shards, also here, you're relatively flexible depending on what you want to build Voruna for. The only thing that I would universally recommend would be 2 yellow shards into casting speed. You can go normal ones, you could even go Tau-forged ones, but in general Voruna spams her abilities quite a bit, so these 2 are definitely convenient. In the other 3 slots, some suggestions that I might have would be Tau-forged blue Archon Shards for more maximum energy. This way, you can maybe get away with not using a flow mod, because I noticed that whenever I was building her, I always had this feeling that I would really love to have just one more mod slot open. However, especially if you want to play her into melee weapons, then of course you can go with the purple shards that give you more melee crit damage. Kinda sort of a no-brainer, right? But okay, so much for the Helminth options as well as the Archon Shards. Before we get into the builds themselves though, there is one more topic that I want to address specifically with Voruna, and that would be survivability, because Voruna always kinda sorta had this reputation of being a bit of a glass cannon. So let's go over our options here. The first and most obvious thing, of course, for every glass cannon frame would be shield gating. I know a lot of players out there really like shield gating on her, and if you want to go for that, that is perfectly viable. You put Brave Respite in your aura, maybe add some additional augur mods, and if you like, you even go for catalyzing shield, rolling guard, whatever floats your boat. This way, you have the standard shield gating playstyle. It should be said though that Voruna herself doesn't really have any abilities that help make shield gating more convenient. You gotta play a little bit more sweaty if that's what you want to go for. If, however, you don't really like this idea, then the exact opposite, which surprisingly also works, would be health tanking. With Voruna Prime, you can get surprisingly tanky, especially if you want to invest a couple Umbra Formas and go for a triple Umbral setup with Umbral Vitality, Fiber, as well as Intensify, which we can then further play into with something like Arcane Blessing, giving us another 1200 health on top, and also very easy to stack up because of all the health orbs that you're gonna drop thanks to your third ability. Also, if you're worried about higher level content and health tanking kind of sort of falling off, then what you could add in as well here would be Arcane Persistence, which ensures that with this health tanking setup, you're gonna stay alive no matter the enemy level. Only obvious problem with this approach though is you need a lot of mod and arcane space. You need 3 mod slots for the Umbrals, plus you burn both arcane slots all just for your survivability. Yes, it is safe to play her like this, but you also really hurt your damage output with the limited mod space that remains. So what I personally opted for in most of my builds would be a sort of shield tanking setup where I focus on getting a lot of shields, adaptation, and then just call it a day. All 3 approaches are viable, but of course, you do you. And with that being said, let's now get into the modding. In this video, I have 3 different builds prepared for you. One is the heavily melee-focused playstyle with Wrathful Advance and the big red crits. The second one is super duper fun and uses your second ability to nuke the entire room. And then thirdly, we're also going to have a no Helminth setup, where we're mostly focusing on our 4, especially given the fact that we can now run on all 4 legs. I thought that was probably something more people would look into, so we're going to incorporate that too. Let's though start out with the Wrathful Advance build, as I think that is probably what most people would want to play. As I previously said, I personally decided to go with shield tanking for my survivability, so what I did is primed redirection as well as arcane expertise in combination with adaptation. With these upgrades, I never really struggled with survivability in Steel Path. The main focus of this build would be to have a lot of ability strength with a decent combination of range and duration as well. The strength part comes from Umbral Intensify as well as Blind Rage and Arcane Ice Storm. However, especially with Arcane Ice Storm, I should say you could replace it with Arcane Impetus, as Voruna is very good at stacking Arcane Impetus up with all the random status effects that she inflicts. Main reason why I didn't want to go for Impetus here is because I wanted the additional 40% duration from Arcane Ice Storm. I was willing to sacrifice a little bit of ability strength for this, but you know, personal preference. If you like Impetus, just put Impetus in here. If you don't want to go for shield tanking, then put Arcane Impetus in here and use both. That is also a great option. Again, you have options. Adjust the build to your personal preference. For the duration, I added Archon Continuity, and also here I should add that Archon Continuity is only really viable if you can fit it onto the build anyway, but if you would have to add an additional Forma just to add Archon Continuity over Prime Continuity, then it is not worth it. The reason for that being is that even if you add 10 Toxin procs with your second ability, Archon Continuity is only going to add 1 Corrosive proc out of this. So yeah, I chose to take the Archon version because it fit the build. If it does not, just go for the normal. Doesn't make much of a difference. As for the range, Archon Stretch is actually pretty nice because you happen to inflict a lot of electricity, and this way you gain a little bit of passive energy income. Also here though, if you don't have the Archon version or you don't want to add an additional Forma for it, it's not the end of the world if you go for normal Stretch instead. But yeah, with this build in total, we have around about 300% strength on our Wrathful Advance with a duration of almost 20 seconds when all the buffs are stacked up. And then all we gotta do is switch on all our buffs and hack away at the enemy, who will have absolutely zero chance of survival. However, if you don't want to go for melee because you think it's boring, then oh boy do I have the NUKE build for you. This one is absolutely ridiculous and it can eradicate entire rooms full of enemies in just a split second. First of all, as I said previously, this build uses Roar as our subsume ability because we want to have as much faction damage bonus as possible for all these status effects that we're going to inflict with our second ability. This right here is going to be the main source of damage and the main focus of the build too. Now, first of all, what we want to make sure is that we have as much strength as possible, not for the rest of our setup, but specifically for our Roar. We want to have as much damage bonus from Roar as possible, which is why we're here going to use Arcane Impetus. We're going to be able to stack that up to the maximum of 13, so we're going to get like 78% more strength from this. And then in addition, we go for Transient Fortitude as well as Precision Intensify. In addition to that, I chose to also go for the Grimoire with this build right here as a secondary weapon. You don't need to carbon copy the build. The only important thing is that it has Foam Invocation, because this one will give us another 60% ability strength that we can snapshot into our Roar to make that even stronger. However, strength is not the only name of the game. We also kind of sort of want to make sure that we have a decent bit of range here to ensure that the status effects will be spread well. My personal preference is going for 190% range, because with this figure, the spread radius of our second ability using the augment for our first is going to be pretty much exactly 30 meters, and that plays nicely into the second synergy that is important for this build, and that would be the Mecha mod set. To make it very short, what the Mecha mod set does is basically exactly the same thing as the status spread from our second ability. Your companion is going to mark an enemy target, and if you take that target out, then all the status effects on that target are going to be spread to other enemies in a 30-meter radius. This is why I'm going for 190% range, so the 30-meter radius from Mecha Empowered is exactly equal to the 30-meter radius of my second ability. And now that we're already speaking about the whole Mecha mods, because of the fact that it is a mod set, we also want to make sure that we have ideally all 4 Mecha mod sets on our setup so that we can get the maximum bonus from the set possible. That's why, in the aura, I go for Mecha Empowered. I also put Mecha Pulse on the build, even though we kind of sort of don't really need it. It's just to have all 4 of the mod set. And then the other 2 mods are going to be on our companion that we're going to take a look at in just a second. Before that, just one thing I want to clarify here. For this build, I do not go for Equilibrium because we're not really going to use our third ability here. With the synergy that we're using, we're actually not going to get a lot of drops out of the third ability, so in my opinion, the better way to go for energy would be with something like Arcane Energize here. In my testing, that proved to be more consistent than Equilibrium. But yeah, that would be Voruna. And now let's take a look at our companion, which is a very vital part of this build. Because we're using the Mecha mod set, we need any type of Kubro companion. You can go for whichever type of Kubro you like. I personally decided to go for the Huras Kubro because the Huras has this beautiful mod called Stalk, which is going to keep us invisible as long as we don't use weapons to attack the enemy. This is a nice second layer of invisibility on top of our first ability, which will give us a lot more survivability. Rest of the build here kind of sort of really does matter, just use whatever. It's an old build of mine that wasn't even made for this specific video. Just gotta say, I used Mecha Recharge here because we have another Mecha mod on this build now. As for the Kubro Claws, also here kind of sort of doesn't matter. I went for Elusive Posture so the Kubro doesn't even attack. Just make sure to put Mecha Overdrive on the claws, because this way we conclude the entire Mecha mod set and gain the maximum bonus of marking an enemy every 15 seconds. The way this looks in practice now is relatively simple. When you activate your first ability and become invisible, then the augment for 1 will mark an enemy. You're then going to use your second ability to attack that enemy and inflict a lot of status effects, which are then going to be spread to nearby enemies, of which 1 or multiple will be marked by your Kubro at that point. And because your second ability and the Mecha mod set kind of sort of do exactly the same thing, this status spread sort of double dips on top of each other, which will then create these absolutely broken strong, insane status chain reactions that you're seeing in the background. It's absolutely ridiculous, and if you haven't done it yet, then you should totally try out this build. But with Voruna Prime now being able to walk on all 4s, that means you probably also want to have a build that is focused on her 4th ability, finally. So let's talk about it. Just like with the other builds, Aura as well as Exiles mod are completely free, go for whatever you like, and also here I went for shield tanking with Prime Redirection and Adaptation, but again, if you want to go for health tanking or shield gating or whatever, just change the build accordingly. Now, one unfortunate thing here is that, as we said in the skills section before, if you want to play into your 4th ability, you kind of sort of have to have the augment. It's kind of sort of mandatory, and that is why we have it in here, of course. And I also added the augment for our 1st ability because it is just so good to spread status in the entire room this way. We then focus on quite a decent bit of ability strength with Blind Rage as well as Arcane Ice Storm and Arcane Impetus. That is going to give us over 300% strength and also a decent bit of range for the status spread from our 2nd as well as the augment for our 1st. If you want to play Voruna into her 4th, then I think this is a great build to go with it. I should say though, I'm still not the biggest fan of playing her for her 4. Because of the tiny, finicky problems that I also mentioned in the skills section earlier, which just make it a bit to play in my opinion. And if you haven't already, then also check out my full guide on the brand new Warframe Folly right here. Another massive shout out to Niels V, Demon Lord Zell, Demon Emperor, Emperor Prime, Lost Linux Gaming, Turtlepeer, Underkanio 2, Skyla Bowser, Mihaki, Socrates the Almighty Rat, Leo Morizaki, Shadow Lockhart, Han Tagas, Patrasator, Boomia1, Mr. Games Plays, Zave, Awendai, Zengen, Quax, Henrik5984, Blue Eagle 98, Hearthwield, Everin8802, Gabriel Tevez, Yaku Ivan Gonzalez, and all other generous channel members for your continuous support. We see each other hopefully in the next one, and until then, as always, good loot.